David and Sarah Williams celebrated their wedding reception in Jackson, Mississippi, then drove into the summer night and vanished forever. Their car was found burned out on a back road, wedding dress still hanging in the back seat. No bodies, no arrests, no justice. For 28 years, their daughter lived with unanswered questions until she uncovered evidence that would bring down an entire town. What she found will make you question everything you thought you knew about hate. July 15th, 2023. 10:30 morgens. Emma Williams had been dreading this moment for months. Standing in the sterile vault of First National Bank in Jackson, Mississippi, she held the key her grandmother had pressed in her hand for years earlier with dying words that still haunted her. "They're all still alive, baby. The evidence is in the box. Make them pay." The safety deposit box hadn't been opened since Ruth Williams' death in 2019. For 28 years, Emma's grandmother had made annual trips from Chicago to this same bank, depositing items that bank records showed but never explained. Emma had grown up believing her parents died in a tragic car accident when she was 1 year old. Only on Ruth's deathbed did she learn the truth. David and Sarah Williams hadn't died in an accident. They'd been murdered. As the metal box slid open, Emma's hands trembled. Inside were 47 photographs, 23 witness statements, and 6 handwritten confessions that would expose the most systematic racial murder cover-up in Mississippi history. The first photograph made her blood run cold. It showed her father's lynched body hanging from an oak tree, surrounded by 12 hooded figures celebrating around a burning cross. The second showed her mother's shallow grave in a remote hunting ground, marked only by a crude wooden cross with "Race Traitor" carved into the wood. But it was the third photograph that shattered her world completely. Clear as day, standing beside the oak tree without his hood, was Sheriff Roy Caldwell, the same man who had led the official investigation into her parents' disappearance. The same man who had told the media that David and Sarah Williams had simply driven away to start fresh somewhere else. Emma sank into a chair as she realized what her grandmother had spent 3 decades collecting. This wasn't just evidence of murder. This was proof of a conspiracy that reached into every corner of Jackson's power structure. Law enforcement, the judiciary, the church, local businesses. Everyone had known. Everyone had covered it up. And everyone responsible was still alive. Her parents hadn't vanished into thin air on their wedding night. They'd been hunted down and slaughtered by a town that couldn't tolerate the sight of black and white love. And for 28 years, their killers had walked free, respected pillars of a community built on blood and lies. But Ruth Williams had never stopped collecting evidence. And now Emma Williams, investigative journalist and daughter of the dead, had everything she needed to bring justice to a town that thought it had buried its sins forever. The reckoning was about to begin. March 15th, 1995, 3 months before David and Sarah Williams would die for loving each other. The voter registration drive at Tougaloo College was winding down when civil rights attorney David Williams first saw Sarah Mitchell across the crowded gymnasium. She was kneeling beside an elderly black woman, patiently helping her fill out paperwork with the kind of gentle attention that suggested genuine care rather than political performance. In a room full of activists making speeches and taking photos, Sarah was simply serving. David had seen plenty of white volunteers come and go during his 3 years practicing civil rights law in Mississippi. Most lasted a few weeks before the social pressure became too much to bear. But something about Sarah felt different. She wasn't there to ease her conscience or pad her resume. She was there because she belonged. "Ma'am, you don't need to be doing that," David heard an elderly black man tell Sarah as she cleaned up registration tables. "That's not work for someone like you." Sarah's response made David fall in love before he'd even spoken to her. "Mr. Washington, justice work is exactly the work for someone like me. My daddy might not agree, but that's between me and my conscience." David Williams was 26 years old, a Howard Law School graduate who had returned to Mississippi specifically to challenge the racial status quo that still dominated the Deep South despite decades of legal progress. He was brilliant, fearless, and completely dedicated to using law as a tool for social change. He was also smart enough to know that a black civil rights attorney dating a white woman in 1995 Mississippi was tantamount to signing his own death warrant. Sarah Mitchell was 24, a University of Mississippi social work graduate whose prominent Jackson family had disowned her the moment she started working with undesirable populations. The daughter of a cotton broker and a garden club president, Sarah had grown up in a world where racial segregation was maintained through country club memberships and neighborhood associations rather than overt violence. She'd rejected that world completely. Their first conversation lasted 4 hours. David had offered to drive Sarah back to Jackson, and they'd ended up parked outside her apartment talking about everything from liberation theology to the economic roots of racial oppression. Sarah spoke with the passion of someone who had discovered that everything she'd been taught about race was a lie. David listened with the wonder of someone meeting his intellectual and moral equal for the first time. "My family thinks I'm going through a phase," Sarah told him that night. "They keep waiting for me to come back to my senses and marry someone appropriate." David laughed. "And what do you think?" "I think my senses are finally working properly," Sarah said. "I think I've been sleepwalking my whole life until now." Their courtship took place in the margins of Mississippi society. They met at black churches where David was a deacon and Sarah was one of the few white faces in the congregation. They attended civil rights conferences in Atlanta and Memphis, where interracial relationships, while unusual, weren't openly hostile. They found safe spaces in university towns and coffee shops in Jackson's slowly integrating downtown. But their love story played out against a backdrop of constant danger. David received death threats for his legal work challenging discriminatory practices in hiring, housing, and voting. Sarah faced ostracism from white society that was swift and total. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Her family's country club revoked her membership. Her mother stopped taking her phone calls. "Are you sure this is worth it?" David asked her after a particularly ugly incident at a restaurant where white patrons had made their hatred known. Sarah's answer became the foundation of their relationship. "David, love that can't survive hatred isn't love at all. It's just convenience dressed up with fancy words." By Christmas 1994, they were inseparable. David had won his first major civil rights case, forcing the Jackson School District to desegregate its advanced placement programs. Sarah had established a legal aid clinic providing free services to domestic violence victims regardless of race. Together, they were building the kind of integrated life that was supposed to be possible in post-civil rights Mississippi, but remained dangerous in practice. Their engagement in February 1995 made the society pages of the Jackson Clarion Ledger, marking the first time an interracial couple had been featured in the newspaper's wedding announcements. The photo showed David in his best suit and Sarah in a simple white dress, both of them beaming with the joy of people who had found their perfect match despite the world's opposition. But the announcement also marked them as targets. Within hours of the newspaper hitting doorsteps across Jackson, David's law office began receiving anonymous phone calls promising violence if the wedding proceeded. Sarah's family publicly disowned her in a statement to the same newspaper that had celebrated her engagement. "We are deeply saddened by our daughter's choices," her father told the reporter. "We can no longer support decisions that bring shame upon our family and community." David and Sarah Williams were two brilliant, brave people whose only crime was loving each other across racial lines in a place and time when such love was still considered revolutionary. They planned to honeymoon in Chicago, where David had received job offers from civil rights organizations impressed by his Mississippi victories. They talked about starting their own law practice, specializing in cases that other attorneys were afraid to take. They dreamed of children who would grow up in a world more just than the one they'd inherited. Children who would never have to choose between love and safety. Children who would see their parents' marriage not as an act of rebellion, but as proof that America could finally live up to its promises. David and Sarah Williams were planning to change the world through love, law, and stubborn refusal to accept that hatred was stronger than hope. They had no idea that some people in Jackson, Mississippi, were planning to ensure they never got the chance. June 17, 1995, 10:30 p.m. David and Sarah Williams were radiating pure joy as they walked hand in hand toward his 1993 Honda Accord, Rice still clinging to Sarah's veil from the celebration that had just ended. Behind them, the Mount Olive Baptist Church glowed with warm light, filled with 150 guests who had witnessed something historic, the first integrated wedding reception in Jackson society's recorded memory. "Mrs. Williams," David said, opening the passenger door with an exaggerated bow, "your chariot awaits." Sarah laughed, gathering the layers of her wedding dress as she slid into the car. "I still can't believe we did it. We're actually married." They had reason to celebrate. Despite anonymous threats, family disownment, and community hostility, David and Sarah had pulled off a wedding that felt like a small victory for love over hate. The church had been filled with an unprecedented mix of black and white faces. Civil rights lawyers, social workers, progressive clergy, and university professors who believed interracial marriage represented hope for Mississippi's future. But as David started the engine at 10:30 p.m., they had no idea that a caravan of pickup trucks had been waiting in the darkness beyond the church parking lot. Sheriff Roy Caldwell sat in the lead vehicle, coordinating with his KKK chapter through police radio frequencies that wouldn't be monitored by federal authorities. "Package is moving," Caldwell radioed to the convoy. "Proceed to Checkpoint Alpha as planned." The couple drove through downtown Jackson, talking excitedly about their honeymoon plans. They would drive through the night to Memphis, sleep until noon, then continue to Chicago, where David had interviews lined up with 3 civil rights organizations. Sarah had carefully hung her wedding dress in the back seat, planning to show it to her supportive college friends in Illinois. At 11:15 p.m., they stopped for gas at a Shell station 15 miles outside Jackson. The attendant, a young black man named Marcus Thompson, would later tell investigators, after years of intimidation silenced him, that he'd noticed several pickup trucks with Confederate flag bumper stickers idling at the station's edges. When David paid for gas, Thompson had quietly warned him, "Brother, you might want to take back roads tonight. Some folks been asking about a wedding car." David thanked him but dismissed the concern. He was a civil rights attorney, accustomed to threats that rarely materialized into actual violence. Sarah was dozing against his shoulder as they pulled back on a Highway 49, heading north toward Memphis and their new life together. At 11:45 p.m., they encountered what appeared to be an accident scene. Orange traffic cones blocked 2 lanes of the highway, and Sheriff Caldwell stood in his uniform directing traffic around scattered debris. David pulled over without hesitation. Helping people was simply who he was. "What happened, officer?" David asked as he stepped out of the Honda. "18-wheeler jackknifed about an hour ago," Caldwell replied, walking toward the car. "Just need you folks to take a detour through the back roads while we clear this mess." That's when the 3 pickup trucks emerged from the tree line with their headlights blazing. Hooded figures poured out carrying baseball bats, tire irons, and rope. Sarah screamed as she realized this wasn't an accident scene. It was an ambush. "David, get back in the car," she yelled, but it was too late. The first blow from a tire iron dropped David to his knees beside their Honda. As he tried to crawl back towards Sarah, more blows rained down on his head and back. Sarah threw herself out of the passenger side, trying to reach her husband, but hooded hands grabbed her arms and dragged her toward the waiting trucks. "Please," Sarah begged, her wedding dress tearing as she struggled. "We haven't done anything wrong. We just got married." "That's exactly what you done wrong," growled a voice from beneath one of the hoods. "White women don't marry animals. Time somebody taught you the natural order." David was beaten unconscious within minutes, his blood staining the asphalt where moments before he'd been offering help to what he thought was an accident victim. Sarah was forced to watch her husband's assault before being dragged to a separate vehicle, her screams echoing across the empty highway. Sheriff Caldwell supervised the scene's cleanup with military precision. The fake accident debris was loaded back into trucks. David's and Sarah's blood was covered with sand and gravel. The Honda was driven to a predetermined location on Back Swamp Road, where it would be doused with gasoline and set ablaze to destroy any forensic evidence. But the wedding dress was left deliberately untouched in the back seat, a message to anyone who might discover the burned car. a symbol that white women who crossed racial lines would face consequences, and that law enforcement would provide no protection. By 3:17 a.m., when a passing motorist called the fire department about a burning vehicle, David and Sarah Williams were already dead. They had been taken to a remote hunting cabin where members of the Jackson County KKK chapter tortured them for hours, demanding they renounce their marriage and beg forgiveness for defiling the white race. David Williams died as he had lived, refusing to betray his principles even under unimaginable pain. Sarah Williams died holding her husband's hand, telling him she loved him until her voice was silenced forever. The couple who had dreamed of changing Mississippi through love and law had become victims of the very hatred they'd hoped to overcome. Their wedding night, which should have begun the most beautiful chapter of their lives, had become their final act of defiance against a system determined to maintain white supremacy through terror. The burning car on Back Swamp Road would be ruled an accident. The couple would be declared missing, presumed to have fled Mississippi voluntarily. And for 28 years, their murders would remain the most carefully guarded secret in Jackson County, until their daughter inherited the evidence that would finally bring their killers to justice. But on that June night in 1995, love had lost to hate, and Mississippi's racists believed they had sent a message that would keep other couples from following David and Sarah Williams' dangerous example. June 18, 1995, 7 a.m. Ruth Williams stood in the Jackson Police Department lobby, her voice breaking as she tried to explain to the desk sergeant that her son and daughter-in-law had vanished on their wedding night. She'd driven down from Memphis at dawn after David failed to call when they were supposed to arrive at their hotel. The burned-out car had been discovered just hours earlier, but no one seemed particularly concerned about finding two missing newlyweds. "Ma'am, people abandon cars all the time," Sergeant Billy Crawford told her, not bothering to look up from his paperwork. "Young couples get cold feet about marriage, decide to run off somewhere and start fresh. Happens more than you'd think." Ruth knew better. David Williams was a civil rights attorney who had been receiving death threats for months. He wouldn't just disappear without explanation, and he certainly wouldn't abandon his legal practice or his family. But explaining this to the Jackson Police Department felt like speaking a foreign language. Sheriff Roy Caldwell arrived at the station an hour later, putting on the performance of his career. He examined the crime scene photos with apparent concern, asked detailed questions about David's legal cases, and promised Ruth that his department would conduct a thorough investigation. What he didn't mention was that he'd personally overseen the murder 12 hours earlier. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to know we're treating this with the utmost seriousness," Caldwell told her, his voice heavy with fabricated sympathy. "Your son was doing important work in our community. We'll find out what happened to him and Sarah." The investigation that followed was a masterclass in systematic obstruction. Every piece of physical evidence mysteriously disappeared or was contaminated beyond use. The tire tracks at the burn site were destroyed by fire department vehicles before investigators could make casts. The wedding photographer's film, which might have shown suspicious individuals at the reception, was confiscated by police and never returned. Marcus Thompson, the gas station attendant who had warned David about suspicious trucks, was visited by 3 deputies the morning after the disappearance. They told him he'd been mistaken about what he'd seen, that his memory of events was unreliable, and that spreading false information about upstanding community members could result in serious legal consequences. Thompson, a 19-year-old with a scholarship to Jackson State University, got the message loud and clear. Dr. William Hartley, the county medical examiner, filed a report stating that no human remains had been recovered from the burned vehicle. This was technically true. The bodies had been buried 40 miles away in an unmarked grave on hunting land owned by KKK member Frank Sullivan. But Hartley's report failed to mention the substantial blood evidence found at the original crime scene, evidence that was collected and then mysteriously lost during transport to the state crime lab. The Mississippi Bureau of Investigation was contacted but declined to get involved, citing lack of evidence of foul play. The FBI was never notified, despite clear indicators that this could be a federal civil rights violation. Judge Harold Pierce, who had presided over several of David's civil rights cases, used his influence to ensure that no federal agencies would be contacted about the disappearance. Meanwhile, the Black community in Jackson organized massive search efforts. Churches chartered buses to scour rural areas where the couple might have been taken. Civil rights organizations offered substantial rewards for information. Volunteers distributed thousands of missing person flyers throughout Mississippi and neighboring states. But every lead led nowhere. Every witness suddenly had memory problems. Every piece of potential evidence vanished before it could be analyzed. The investigation was being systematically sabotaged by the very people responsible for conducting it. Ruth Williams hired private investigator James Monroe, a former FBI agent with experience in civil rights cases. Monroe immediately identified suspicious patterns in the official investigation. The burned site had been processed incorrectly. Key witnesses hadn't been interviewed. Physical evidence had been mishandled. But when Monroe began asking pointed questions about these failures, he found doors closing and sources becoming uncooperative. On July 15th, exactly 1 month after the disappearance, Monroe's office was broken into. Nothing was stolen except files related to the Williams case. Monroe received an anonymous phone call the next morning. Some cases don't need solving. Some families need to learn when to stop asking questions. Monroe withdrew from the case 2 days later, citing personal safety concerns. He moved his family to Atlanta within a month, effectively ending the only independent investigation into David and Sarah's disappearance. By September 1995, Sheriff Caldwell held a press conference announcing that the investigation was being suspended due to lack of evidence. "We believe David and Sarah Williams left Mississippi voluntarily," he told reporters. "Young couples sometimes make impulsive decisions about their future. We found no evidence of foul play." The case was officially closed on October 1st, 1995, 3 months and 2 weeks after David and Sarah had driven into their wedding night and vanished forever. The Jackson Clarion-Ledger ran a small article on page 6, noting that the search for the missing couple had been called off due to lack of leads. Ruth Williams was devastated but not defeated. She began her own investigation, carefully documenting every inconsistency in the official story, every witness who had been intimidated into silence, every piece of evidence that had mysteriously disappeared. She opened a safety deposit box at First National Bank and began collecting proof that her son and daughter-in-law had been murdered by the very people sworn to protect them. For 28 years, Ruth would make annual trips from Chicago to Jackson, adding new evidence to her secret collection. Deathbed confessions from guilt-ridden participants. Photographs taken by KKK members as trophies. Witness statements from people who had finally found the courage to speak. She never lived to see justice served. But she made sure the evidence would survive her, waiting for the day when someone with the power to seek accountability would finally open that safety deposit box and expose the truth about what happened to David and Sarah Williams on their wedding night. The investigation had been sabotaged from the moment it began. But the real investigation, Ruth Williams' quiet, methodical collection of evidence, was just getting started. And it would take 28 years to bear fruit. October 1995. 4 months after David and Sarah vanished, Ruth Williams packed her belongings in Jackson with the methodical precision of someone who understood she was never coming back. The house where David had grown up, where she'd raised him to believe in justice and equality, no longer felt safe. Anonymous phone calls came at all hours. Bricks had been thrown through her windows twice. The message was clear. Grieving mothers who asked too many questions weren't welcome in Jackson, Mississippi. But Ruth wasn't just leaving town. She was beginning a mission that would consume the next 28 years of her life. The safety deposit box at First National Bank became her secret archive. Every month, Ruth made the 8-hour drive from Chicago back to Jackson, adding new pieces to a puzzle that law enforcement refused to solve. A photograph slipped to her by a church janitor who'd seen something the night of the wedding. A confession letter from a dying KKK member's widow. Financial records showing suspicious cash transactions among prominent white families in the weeks after the murder. By 2000, Ruth had documented 12 participants in the conspiracy. By 2005, she had photographs proving Sheriff Caldwell's involvement. By 2010, she possessed detailed maps showing where her son and daughter-in-law had been buried. But she was an elderly black woman in Chicago trying to expose powerful white men in Mississippi. Who would believe her? Who would act on her evidence? The conspiracy, meanwhile, thrived in its success. Sheriff Roy Caldwell served 25 years before retiring with full honors in 2020. Judge Harold Pierce became a respected elder statesman, dying peacefully in his sleep in 2018 after 40 years on the bench. Dr. William Hartley opened a thriving private practice and was named Jackson's Citizen of the Year in 2008. The financial benefits of the murder were distributed carefully among the conspirators. Frank Sullivan's construction company received no-bid county contracts worth millions. Reverend Thomas Mitchell's church became the largest white congregation in Jackson, supported by anonymous donations from grateful parishioners. The economic advantages of maintaining white supremacy through violence paid dividends for decades. But guilt is a poison that spreads slowly through communities built on blood. Some conspirators developed drinking problems that destroyed their marriages. Others left Jackson entirely, unable to live with memories of what they'd done. A few tried to confess to pastors or family members, only to be warned that some secrets are too dangerous to tell. The annual KKK reunions became smaller and more paranoid as members aged and died. The younger generation of white supremacists preferred subtler methods of maintaining racial hierarchy, gerrymandering, voter suppression, economic discrimination. Lynching was bad for tourism and economic development. Emma Williams grew up in Chicago completely unaware of her parents' true fate. Ruth carefully constructed a story about a tragic car accident, protecting her granddaughter from the knowledge that could destroy her childhood innocence. Emma excelled in school, graduated from Northwestern University, and became an investigative journalist, inheriting her father's passion for justice without understanding its deadly cost. But as Ruth aged, the weight of carrying such a massive secret began destroying her health. Heart palpitations, chronic insomnia, and depression took their toll. She knew she was dying with evidence that could finally bring justice, but she was terrified of putting Emma in danger by revealing the truth. The turning point came in 2018, when Ruth watched news coverage of the FBI finally prosecuting cold cases from the civil rights era. Federal authorities were using modern forensics and witness testimony to convict men who thought they'd escaped justice for decades. For the first time in 23 years, Ruth felt hope that her evidence might actually lead to prosecutions. On her deathbed in 2019, Ruth made her decision. She pressed the safety deposit box key in Emma's hand and whispered the words that would change everything. "They're all still alive, baby. The evidence is in the box. Make them pay." Ruth Williams died believing her son and daughter-in-law would finally receive justice. She'd spent 28 years methodically collecting proof that David and Sarah Williams hadn't died in an accident. They'd been lynched by pillars of the Jackson community who were still living comfortable lives built on murder and silence. The evidence waited in that bank vault for 4 more years, until Emma Williams finally found the courage to return to Mississippi and open the box that would expose the most carefully guarded secret in Jackson's history. 28 years of silence was about to end with a reckoning that would destroy everyone who thought they'd gotten away with the perfect hate crime. Ruth Williams' greatest fear had been that her granddaughter would never learn the truth. Her greatest hope was that Emma would be strong enough to seek justice when the time finally came. Both turned out to be right. July 15th, 2023, 10:45 morgens. Emma Williams' hands trembled as she spread the contents of her grandmother's safety deposit box across the First National Bank conference table. 28 years of methodical evidence collection lay before her. 47 photographs, 23 witness statements, and 6 handwritten confessions that painted a picture of coordinated racial murder that had been hidden in plain sight. The first photograph showed Sheriff Roy Caldwell without his hood, standing beside her father's lynched body with a satisfied smile. The second captured Judge Harold Pierce directing the burial operation at a remote hunting lodge. The third documented Reverend Thomas Mitchell, Sarah's own uncle, blessing the murder weapons with a makeshift cross. But it was the witness statements that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Marcus Thompson, the gas station attendant, had finally broken his silence in 2015, providing a detailed account of the pickup trucks that had followed David and Sarah into the night. Dr. Patricia Williams, a nurse at Jackson General Hospital, had documented treating KKK member Frank Sullivan for injuries sustained during the beating, injuries that were explained away as a hunting accident. The confession letters were the most damning evidence. Deacon Robert Hayes had written a 6-page account before his death in 2017, describing in horrific detail how the couple had been tortured for hours before being killed. They never begged, Hayes wrote. Even with everything we did to them, they kept holding hands and telling each other they loved each other. It broke something in me that never healed. Emma's investigation revealed that 8 of the 12 original conspirators were still alive, most living comfortable retirements funded by decades of economic benefit from their crime. Sheriff Caldwell, now 78, owned a sprawling ranch outside Jackson. Judge Pierce's son had inherited his father's law practice and political connections. Reverend Mitchell's church had grown into a megachurch empire worth millions. But Ruth Williams had also collected the key to destroying them all: GPS coordinates leading to her son and daughter-in-law's burial site, preserved by a guilt-ridden participant who had secretly maintained the grave for 28 years. Emma closed the box, her grandmother's mission now her own. The evidence was overwhelming. The perpetrators were identifiable. And for the first time since 1995, someone with the power to seek justice finally knew the truth about what happened to David and Sarah Williams on their wedding night. Ruth Williams had spent 28 years collecting the tools for justice. Now her granddaughter would use them to bring down everyone who thought they'd committed the perfect hate crime. August 2nd, 2023, 6 a.m. Emma Williams published her investigation simultaneously across 12 news organizations, ensuring no single entity could suppress the story. The headline read, "Lynched on their wedding night. How Mississippi officials murdered an interracial couple and covered it up for 28 years. Within hours, the story exploded across social media. The photographs of Sheriff Roy Caldwell standing beside David Williams' lynched body went viral, accompanied by bank records showing how the conspiracy had enriched its participants for decades. Judge Harold Pierce's son immediately resigned from his law practice. Reverend Thomas Mitchell's megachurch lost half its congregation before noon. The FBI arrived in Jackson by 2 p.m., led by Special Agent Maria Santos, who specialized in cold case civil rights violations. The evidence Emma had inherited was overwhelming. Photographs, confessions, witness statements, and GPS coordinates leading to her parents' burial site. This represents one of the most systematic hate crime cover-ups we've ever documented, Agent Santos told reporters. 8 surviving conspirators participated in a racially motivated double murder and then used their positions of authority to hide their crimes for nearly 3 decades. The excavation of the burial site confirmed Ruth Williams' 28 years of investigation. David and Sarah's remains were found exactly where the GPS coordinates indicated, along with physical evidence proving they had been tortured before being killed. Forensic analysis revealed rope burns consistent with lynching and bullet wounds consistent with execution. Sheriff Roy Caldwell, now 78, was arrested at his ranch while feeding cattle. Judge Pierce's estate was raided, revealing documents he'd hidden describing the conspiracy's coordination. Reverend Mitchell was taken into custody during Sunday morning services, his congregation watching in shock as federal agents led their pastor away in handcuffs. The confession letters proved that David and Sarah Williams had died as they lived, refusing to compromise their principles even under unimaginable torture. They had been murdered not just for being an interracial couple, but for representing the possibility that love could triumph over Mississippi's centuries-old racial hierarchy. By evening, all 8 surviving conspirators were in federal custody, facing hate crime charges that carried potential death sentences. The conspiracy that had maintained silence for 28 years crumbled in a single day, destroyed by the evidence one grandmother had spent her lifetime collecting. Emma Williams stood at her parents' grave for the first time, finally able to tell them that justice was coming. Ruth Williams' greatest hope, that her granddaughter would be strong enough to seek accountability, had been fulfilled beyond her wildest dreams. The perfect hate crime had finally been exposed, and Mississippi was about to reckon with the blood on its hands. March 20th, 2024. Federal Courthouse, Jackson, Mississippi. The verdict that took 28 years to reach was delivered in less than 3 hours. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in violation of federal civil rights statutes, we find the defendant Roy Caldwell guilty. 8 consecutive guilty verdicts echoed through the packed courtroom as Emma Williams sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Roy Caldwell received life without parole. Judge Harold Pierce's estate faced massive civil penalties despite his death. Reverend Thomas Mitchell got 25 years, his congregation finally understanding why their pastor had preached so much about forgiveness and letting sleeping dogs lie. The $47 million civil settlement awarded to Emma Williams sent shockwaves through Mississippi's power structure. Jackson County was forced to admit institutional liability for the murder and cover-up. The sheriff's department was disbanded and rebuilt under federal oversight. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to examine other suspicious cases from the same era. But the most powerful change was personal. Emma used her settlement to establish the David and Sarah Williams Foundation for Racial Justice, providing legal aid to families of hate crime victims and funding cold case investigations across the South. She returned to Mississippi permanently, opening the foundation's headquarters in the same building where her father had once practiced civil rights law. The memorial garden at the site where David and Sarah were murdered became a pilgrimage destination for couples of all races. Their wedding photo, displayed alongside Ruth Williams' investigative archives, told a story of love surviving hate across generations. The inscription read, "Love that can survive hatred isn't just love, it's revolution." Jackson's transformation wasn't complete or perfect. Some residents still defended the conspirators as products of their time. Economic anxiety about federal oversight and legal settlements created new tensions. But the city that had once murdered an interracial couple for loving publicly was now led by its first black female mayor, who declared David and Sarah Williams Day an annual celebration of courage over hatred. Emma Williams had inherited her grandmother's mission and her father's passion for justice. Standing in the memorial garden where her parents were killed, she understood that their love story hadn't ended in 1995. It had just taken 28 years to reach its true conclusion. Ruth Williams' greatest fear was that the truth would die with her. Her greatest hope was that love would finally triumph over hate. Both had been answered. Justice may have taken 28 years, but it had arrived exactly when Emma Williams was strong enough to carry it home. David and Sarah Williams' love story proves that hatred may win battles, but love wins wars. Their wedding night ended in tragedy, but their legacy transformed a community and inspired a generation. Ruth Williams' 28 years of patient evidence collection shows that justice delayed is not justice denied when someone refuses to give up. Emma Williams inherited more than evidence. She inherited the responsibility to ensure that love stories like her parents don't end in unmarked graves. Their sacrifice became the foundation for change that neither David nor Sarah lived to see, but both died believing was possible. How many other couples have been silenced by hate? How many families are still searching for truth that powerful people want buried? What happens when an entire community chooses silence over justice? Drop a comment below and let us know. Do you believe love can truly triumph over generations of hate? Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that prove justice may take decades, but it never stops coming.